Um, Thank you all for being here tonight to this Thursday public event at the KTH School of Architecture. This lecture is part of a series called As Project, where architects and other practitioners in the field of architecture are invited to talk about one project in great depth and detail, to really try to go into a specific case study, but also as a way to sort of have an ongoing discussion about what the project in architecture is or could be. And I'm very happy to have Alastair Parvin here tonight, he will tell you more about the project WikiHouse. He's standing here, inventor, designer, and co-founder of the WikiHouse Foundation. And I think it's interesting or important to point out, at least what I think is so valuable and interesting about the WikiHouse is like it shows that the promise of information technology and computation in architecture does not have to do with making drawings in pixels instead of in ink, but rather that it enables things that was not even thinkable before information technology, in sort of in the sharing of information and the sharing of ideas and the sort of creation of communities around architectural projects. And it sort of shows that the real important parameters, if you're talking about sort of parametricism, which is often sort of associated with digital things in architecture, are not maybe shapes and forms, but the parameters are economical, they are means of production, users, producers, actors. These are the parameters and forces shaping architecture, and by sort of manipulating or acting on those parameters, a completely kind of architectural project can be produced. And I think that the work that you and your colleagues have put forward sort of is a case in point. So welcome, Alastair, and I think we'll have some questions. Time for questions afterwards.
Yeah,
and maybe talk about the.
If you want to heckle, ask questions during, that's okay as well. Because look, the fancy smooth slides are all gone to poo. So we may as well just mess everything up. And feel free to just stick up your hand and shout out anytime you like. I think. When we were first talking about this talk, we were balancing between the title "Architecture as Housing as Project" and "Democracy as Project." And Bjorn thought that the second one was a bit too big, but obviously today in the UK is election day, so I had to tear myself away from that because I get very excited on election day, or democracy day as I call it. And hopefully by the end of the talk we'll in some ways have serviced both. The thing you say about, so yeah, let's talk about housing instead of democracy, but we'll get to both. Where democracy and housing meet, one thing we can be solid on is this idea of the good life, which is this basic kind of affluence. So a lot of architecture and everything has been shaped by this history of the 1960s, this generation, basically our parents' generation, who had access to good housing. They had access to amazing education. They had access to amazing resources, this explosion of abundance, and you know, the institutions that supported that. Cedric Price said technology is the answer, but what was the question? That's a kind of guiding thing for us, and I think you could also say the same thing about architecture. Design is powerful because when it's successful, it's actually invisible. We take it for granted, and this is fine, and that's like the good life. This explosion of abundance and consumption, this generation of people who suddenly got access to Coca-Cola, etc., and washing machines and air conditioning and housing and mortgages. And the problem with that is that not only do we as a society take it for granted, but particularly architecture and design industries also became blind to it. And so for a long time, architecture really hasn't had a conversation about the economics behind this, the industrial systems that actually created this. Who do we work for? Who pays us? What are we actually doing? What are the civic frameworks, the industrial frameworks that we work within, and behind that, the economic frameworks? And one of the things that I think is interesting about this generation of designers and technologists is that whether we like it or not, with the kind of Silicon Valley tech movement, etc., the new pieces of technology that we're developing are not just commodities. They are whole systemic new industrial frameworks that change the way that we organize ourselves, which isn't always easy to see, but it's far more important. So there's a lot of soul searching for architecture to do here. I'm clearly behind on the slides. I feel like Britney Spears with this thing on. Yeah, so basically behind the scenes of these everyday abundances, the Coca-Colas that we enjoy, it's not Coca-Cola actually, yeah, it's something much more healthy, is this system, this industrial machine that created this extraordinary abundance and this idea of the good life. And what's happening in our generation is that that's failing in a lot of different areas, but particularly within the domain of housing. The idea that you can put aside some money and afford a home is not working, even in very wealthy developed economies, and that's really, really interesting. So this is our UK graph for the UK. So this is called The Graph. We did this research a few years ago. It's recently found its way even onto Newsnight on the telly, because housing has become so bad that housing is now a serious issue. Yeah, basically it's a kind of brief timeline of housing in Britain over the post-war era. So obviously this is all who was in charge. This is the dates. This is the supply of new homes. And we can see that basically it's been slowly falling away. The explosion of post-war, the state, then this kind of rise of the market, of the development market, the push of the state into these housing associations, basically beginning to slowly dwindling away. And as a result, of course, of like any economist will tell you, when you have low supply, you have rising demand and inflation. And so we've had this massive, explosive price inflation in housing. This, by the way, this is why I don't call myself an architect, by the way, because I think we accidentally became design economists or something. Like, we have to talk about this stuff in order to understand what we're doing. So all of the money in architecture that was flushing through the architecture in the late 2000s was this money. It was inflation. It was not growth. It was land price inflation, and that land price inflation was being captured and it was being funneled towards an architecture industry. So when it then crashed in 2008 and there was this dump of unemployment, that's why. And architects moaned about this bit, but actually we should have been moaning about this bit. It's because we weren't looking at the economic framework that we were working in and where the money was coming from. So before coming here, I thought I'd give an attempt. It's a bit of a ropey attempt to try and do the same graph for Sweden. So this is the equivalent of that graph for you guys. And it seems to me, and so you can probably shout if you guys are be interested to learn more about how the housing crisis is here, but it seems to me that you have a not entirely dissimilar picture. So, okay, it's more recent, but I don't know what happened here, but I'm assuming you guys had an explosion of supply in around the 60s onwards, dwindling supply, and in this explosion of inflating prices. Now, it's worth pointing out that particularly private developers will love to tell you that it's a pure supply and demand problem, and that they just need to supply. It's not. The actual housing need is at a certain level, but this, you can see, is explosive, not quite as exponential as ours, but nonetheless really huge in relation to kind of living prices. So, and actually that's driven by speculation, not just not just scarcity. So of course, when land becomes scarce, it becomes an investment asset, which drives more people into it. So you start getting speculative investment money, treating it as a financial asset, which in turn drives demand even higher, and then et cetera, et cetera. It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. And so again, yeah, the basic reality of that for most people in the UK is that since 1971, our houses have inflated in price by 7,000%, whereas our wages have inflated by that much. And for years, we called it growth. We called it a housing boom or a property ladder. We built this whole industry called urban regeneration in the 90s and 2000s, and architects went and worked for it. But actually, of course, it's a massive crisis. And of course, everyone thinks, oh, my house went up in value. And then they zoom out and they realize, of course, everyone's houses have got up in value. So the idea that this is good news for you is a total trick. Like, it is not good news for you. It just means your next house has doubled in value, or accordingly, your next house has halved in size. So certainly, you guys are not doing so well either. This is UK building the second smallest houses in Europe, Sweden. This was actually the peak of the boom. Sweden, not far off either. Why is it that wealthy countries are building tiny box houses? Something to do with the economics of what's going on here. That also means, when you have this inflation, that you get into this self-perpetuating loop because you don't have competition on quality. So because if you don't have market competition going on, you don't have people with any power, you have this essentially a democratic legitimacy crisis, because you have a constrained supply of land, you have price inflation, you get therefore low competition on quality, so you get poor quality homes that disenfranchise people, so therefore there's public resistance to new development on new land, and then that in turn locks the planning system. So you end up in this Gordian knot, this vicious downward cycle of housing crisis. So behind it all is a question. There's so much misinformation in the housing thing. So behind it all is this question, and it doesn't get asked enough, which is, who actually builds them? Who are we working for when architects are designing houses? This is the literal answer. Again, I apologize, it's for the UK, but I understand it's not a totally different story here. This is a graph. This is not a blank page. This is a graph of who builds our homes in the UK. Along the x-axis are all the people who built a home, and on the y-axis is how many they built, and they don't even fit on the page. So this is a super long tail graph. In the UK, almost half of all the houses we made by just 10 companies. I'm told it's more like 4 companies here. So this absolute dependence on a tiny number of massive top-down developers. And that model is one of the things we take for granted. And I apologize here because we're going to have to start unpacking the obvious, because it's so obvious that no one's been talking about how this actually works. Which is, fundamentally, since the Industrial Revolution, our housing models have not changed. Why we were doing them has changed. So it began as housing for the poor, then it began as housing for the workers, then it became housing for the people in the welfare state, now it's housing for the borrowers. But the fundamental idea, the model, hasn't changed, which is you take a piece of land and the first thing you do is you clear it. Politically, physically, you clear that land, you clear the land. And this, obviously, if you go to Cape Town and look at District 6, apartheid South Africa has very political overtones, but it always has political overtones. And then you got this one single developer who bought the land, and they hire one architect and one contractor, and they get them to do this design. And of course, form follows finance is the actual rule of architecture. And so what you end up with is this single monolithic chunk of capital turning into a single monolithic building. And that's why many of our buildings look the way they do. Not because it's the best way that we decided to live in the future, it's because actually it's the most efficient way of building if you're from the supply side. And even more deep within the things we take for granted is the weirdness of this, which is that it's not designed for people. Like, if you ask a child, how do you think we build houses in our society? They say, well, probably someone needs a house and they go and get one. That's not how it works. You get this architect, this company hires an architect to imagine this imaginary average person, and they design this imaginary average box. And again, this is ingrained. This is what architects were taught for like a century, that this is how you design housing. Very, very weird. And of course, what you then do is you apply for planning applications to governments, public institutions who are largely dependent on private developers to provide any kind of affordable housing, and so that you ask a human. So you have to get someone to produce a load of drawings, and then you send it off to a human, because our planning systems were designed before computers or the internet. So you have to. Now the problem with this is it's a highly corruptible system, because if you catch that person, that human, on a good day, they'll say yes. If you catch them on a bad day, they'll say no. If they like the colour blue, they'll say yes. If they don't, they'll say no. If they happen to politically need a particular need of a certain kind of outcome. So it's a highly corruptible system. Not necessarily in the brown envelope sense, but in the more tacit sense. And then, of course, you get your massive chunk of financial capital, and you, entirely through the monetary economy, you procure this building and you construct it. Now, the open secret behind this, and the thing that, again, as a profession, architecture has been blind to for a long time, is that we are not designing houses. We're designing financial real estate properties. Does anyone know what this is? Correct. Yeah, this is the original monopoly board from the US Patent Office. It was originally designed, ironically, as a cautionary tale. So it was designed as a game to explain to everybody how stupid it would be if you allow monopoly real estate to dominate the housing sector. And it massively backfired, because instead of taking the actual lesson from the game, which is 3 out of 4 people lose, we took the one, hey, it might be me that wins. And that, of course, is exactly what happened in the real life as well. And of course, what you end up with is this. Because it's designed as a financial asset, a piece of real estate, of course, the developer, in an inflating economy, has no competition on quality. So, of course, what they do is you've basically created an industry that has a really good incentive to reduce what is meant by home. So, of course, they shrink the houses. They take the balconies off. They make the ceilings low. If you're an architect who's worked in practice, you will be familiar with these arguments, these frustrations with your client who comes along and says, yeah, I want you to make it a little bit crapper. Right? And I mean, this is what got me started, by the way, in 2006 when I was working, it was really fantastic times, but everybody was talking about this stuff. I was like, this is interesting, because there's something weird in the economics going on. It's also a massive problem, because every government in the world right now has a policy to make more sustainable housing, but developers see everything that we see as good about housing as costs. Quality, sustainability, affordable. Everything we see as good about a house is just a cost to them, because their job is to service their shareholders. Now, that does not make them bad people. They're perfectly good people, and they're doing their job. Most of what we call bad design is not bad design. It's very good design for a totally different economic outcome than the one we think we're working on. And it's because, as architects, we've been naive to the economics of our own industry that we didn't spot this sooner. And of course, the neighborhood that you end up with isn't a real neighborhood. It's this kind of planned dead body of a neighborhood that people then just sort of move in. It's effectively this kind of, I think of them as hotels for people with mortgages. They're just permanent hotels, right? They're not places where you want to bring up kids or put down roots, or you can start a business. They're just like hotel rooms, and you hire one, and you have a concierge sometimes if you're in one of the really expensive buildings, who actually, and some of them actually have like swimming pools and stuff. And so it's basically a big stack of mortgage debt which we happen to live in. They're socially isolating. There's no community ties. And they're effectively consumer neighborhoods. There's no productivity in these. Now, if you think that diagram is us being a cartoon, that's literally what we're building. This is not communist Russia in the 1930s. This is East London a few years ago. We're literally building that diagram, and we're calling it a city. Now, the reason, and by the way, occasionally what you do is you hire an architect to come along and jiggle up the facades a bit and sort of pretend that it's not, it's not what it is. So this is London. This is the UK. Looks different, but fundamentally it's the same animal. Just turning these one-size little boxes out and then just moving people in and giving them a mortgage. And that's where that model had its roots, Levittown in the USA in the 50s. This is what built the good life. This was the Coca-Cola model of housing. And at the peak of its production, this Fordist approach to housing production could turn out something like one home every hour or something. It was an extraordinary feat of mass production. And they built whole towns, Levittown, they're still called that. And so you can go almost anywhere in the world and find that this is basically the model that we're using. So not only have we used it, regardless of whether it's being done by the state or the market or whoever, our basic assumption is that the only way to build housing at scale is this top-down, massively centralized housing production model. Housing done to people, not by people. Development done to people, not by people. Now, not only is that pretty horrific from a democracy point of view, it also doesn't work. And that's the thing that terrifies me, is that right now, in developed countries like Sweden and the UK, we are experiencing the failure of this model, just as the Chinese are replicating it on a massive scale. Our housing crisis is a teeny tiny gentle dress rehearsal for what they're going to hit in a few years' time. And that really terrifies me. Because the fundamental ironic truth of this is that these types of massively top-down planned neighborhoods is both the norm in housing still, and yet there is almost no single example of it ever producing a culturally, economically, and socially successful neighborhood. Try and think of one. The most economically and culturally productive neighborhoods that you can think of, I bet you anything, they're much more hodgepodge. They developed on a variety of plots slowly over time by many people, not just by one person. Most of these end up being demolished as housing projects, or they end up as just these stagnating Consumerville kind of entities. So this is an amazing example. This is in Angola, where Chinese financial capital has been building whole cities in the desert. This is called Kilambakiaxi. And for years, whole tracts of it just sit empty, which is just extraordinary. So I thought, again, this is where heckling is involved, because I thought I'd take this slide out because I'm coming over to Sweden, and I thought actually I'll leave it in because it's quite interesting. So I wanted to talk about, we have this massive housing crisis, this failure, this explosion of debt, or in the developing world, deprivation, but fundamentally it's different arms of the same housing crisis. What are the policies that our governments are currently putting forward? Because they clearly don't have a solution. They're so wrapped up in the old state versus market narrative of the world because they're not thinking like designers, they're just thinking like tribalists. So it's interesting to do a quick analysis of the policies on offer, and I'd love to try and shout out if the equivalent policy exists in here. So I imagine this one exists, right? There's probably one of the parties arguing that your housing crisis could be solved if you can cut immigration. Yes? No? Yeah. Bad news is, sorry Nigel Farage and co, it doesn't work. It's a complete myth. Because demand for housing is effectively infinite, even with things like rental controls. There'll always be a speculator to build it. So immigration doesn't actually make that much difference, because fundamentally if an immigrant doesn't buy it, somebody will buy it and just have a second home instead. So that doesn't work. Second one is where you give, it's called right to buy, but whether either the public or the private sector just give more debt. So that's what we did to the 2000s. We said we've got this constrained supply, don't worry, we'll just make loads of cheap credit. And then, oh man, we shouldn't really be, well, we'll make this thing called the subprime mortgage and we'll hand those out. What can possibly go wrong? That didn't work out either. It literally crashed the global economy. This is, actually I've flipped those out. I meant help to buy was the previous one. The other one is right to buy. Again, there's probably a very specific thing. You guys do not have right to buy, but I bet you have political parties arguing for it, which is where people get to buy social rented accommodation and become homeowners at massive cost to the state. Again, doesn't increase the supply of actual housing. It just makes a few people feel a bit richer. This I know you will definitely have. So when the topic of housing crisis comes up and it goes on the news, you will get a spokesperson from one of the big construction companies will come along and say, we've got to release more land, you've got to cut our regulations so that we can provide you with more housing. This is one of the great paradoxes that's so hard to communicate in a soundbite on, on a news thing. developers will never solve the housing crisis, because it's like asking a diamond trader to reduce the price of diamonds, right? That it's like no sensible developer, no matter how much land we give them, is ever going to build so many houses that so fast that prices stop going up, because their shareholders would sack them, quite rightly. So it's a complete myth that if you just create a whole load of new land and then deregulate them on quality, they'll build, because you'll just end up with a load of crappy homes at the same price. No one will be able to afford them. So that's not a solution either. These are in order of stupidity, by the way. So, immigration was the most stupid. They're getting a bit smarter as we go on. The other one is regulate house builders. Again, bashing them around the head won't help either, right? So obviously this tends to be the center right. This tends to be the center left. Doesn't really help either. And the problem is, John Taylor, I mean, he's sort of amazing books on this. John Turner, sorry, Taylor. John Turner, if you've never read the book Housing by People by John Turner, it is the Bible to me. It's one of the greatest books ever written, ever. And he articulates this point very, very beautifully, which is the housing problem is not a problem of standards. You know, as we were saying, giving someone a slightly better sink is not actually the core need. Housing is there as a platform for your life. So the primary functions of a house is where it's located, close to a job, does it have infrastructure, is it affordable? Actually, people can tolerate amazingly shabby housing as long as it's providing those basic platforms. And I recently did this on Twitter. If anyone wants to do this, it'll be really interesting. I put out a survey on Twitter where we tried to, I thought we could collectively try to write a sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for housing, where everybody puts in order the function that a home has in their lives in order. And by the way, the thing that's coming back that I've looked at so far is that the top chunk have nothing to do with the actual standard or quality of the home. It's entirely about location, access to jobs, access to education, etc., etc. Oh yeah, we've sort of done that one already. The final one is a social rented housing boom. Again, that's all well and good, but only if, say in the UK, it's not going to fix the broken market. It's just going to mean more people can live in the safety net. You guys have, by the sounds of it, an extreme version of this, where you have such massive rent controls that effectively everybody lives in a safety net, and actually we know that the safety net can never be big enough. And so you just have housing waiting lists forever and ever and ever, while your middle classes are just screwed. So this could be done, but only with sort of communist levels of, of top-down development. So crap, because that leaves us with no policies. And genuinely, most of the parties are plugging one of those lines, and there's not a lot else on the table. And so this is this problem. So this question of who actually builds homes. If homes being valued as financial assets can't deliver actual housing for us, so the question is, who can actually build homes that are going to be, and will build homes that will be affordable, sustainable, etc., large, generous, well-designed to the max? Well, of course, the answer is really, really obvious. The only people with an incentive to put more insulation in the walls are the people paying the heating bills. I.e. who see the home not as a financial asset, but as a place where they're going to live. They're still investing, but they're investing for a totally different value outcome. But the problem is, of course, you can't turn them into a mass housing sector. The conventional wisdom has been that our industrial society's scale must be big and top-down and mass-produced, and that is the only way to do it. That's always been the fundamental assumption. That's why that's where WikiHouse starts. That's why it's interesting to us, because we do not believe that's true anymore. So we are heading into this thing that's been called the third industrial revolution. That's not a hubristic thing to say. A series of technologies are going to fundamentally change the economics of production in the same way that the first industrial revolution did, and the second one. And actually, we've already begun to see this. So if you think it sounds a bit outlandish that this might happen, just think of what the web has already done to the software and media industries over the last 10 years. They've massively moved us from systems where you had centralized production to decentralized production. So from Britannica and Carter to Wikipedia. from Hollywood only to Hollywood plus YouTube. So that has happened in the world of software. There are a series of technologies now going to be happening over the next 5-10 years that are happening now that are going to see exactly the same thing in the world of physical things. Physical stuff's about to get Napsterized, was the phrase I heard someone say once. The 4 basic shifts are the web, easy, obvious one, which is particularly the semantic web, making it much, much easier to effectively share stuff instantaneously if we can codify knowledge. Effectively, that means that we can move into, well, there'll be 2 effects of that. One will be that the lawyers will come out in force because someone will say, you downloaded my design and I'm going to send my lawyers and you copied it, right? Or there'll be people who say that is a waste of human life. Why don't we accept that the cost of copying is 0 and embrace it, make stuff open source, allow other people to replicate it? Very, very quickly, that will outperform the old economy because effectively an open source economy is one in which no problem needs to be solved twice. Now, this is particularly pertinent for architecture industries, where architecture is in a crisis going, oh no, there's no real estate money anymore. It's like, well, and yet you're still sitting there with a Victorian labour model where you have an unpaid intern sitting there doing a 2D detail drawing, and down the road there's another unpaid intern doing the same detail drawing because no one was ever sharing, right? It's completely unnecessary. So that's the web. Second one is digital fabrication. 3D printing gets all the press, but actually there are many forms of digital fabrication, and most of the most interesting ones haven't been invented yet. Again, interesting thing around patents and stuff here, but I won't go into that. Third one is automation. Automation is, again, is the robots argument, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. Middle-class labour is going to get automated. So this is, on one level, hugely potentially damaging to middle-class labour economies. And if you thought that the political fights of the 20th century, when manual labour started getting automated, were bad, just wait till you do it to the middle classes. That's a really big economic disruption. But also, those tools are allowing us to do amazing things, to tame complexity, to take really complex problems and to solve them for 0 effort. And the final one is data, which there's enough people bashing on about without me adding to it. But the fundamental quality of data is that it will put really interesting pressures on the centralized housing system, because for the first time we're going to have actual information on how our homes actually perform. Not just technically, not just in terms of environmental performance, but we'll begin to have actual data about, do they improve our lives? Do they improve our economic and health outcomes? And suddenly it's going to become very transparent that certain kinds of housing is bad for people. So that's going to be really interesting. It's going to change the way that we value the function of houses. Put simply, it's going to move us from valuing homes as a noun to valuing homes as a verb. Housing as a noun to housing as a verb, which is another John Turner line. So what that is basically making possible is this explosion of distributed manufacturing, sometimes called the maker movement. Maker movement's the temporary name, right? But it actually, because it's just, a lot of it's just fun, right? But actually this is really serious. So suddenly you can go to a point where what used to require a whole factory costing hundreds of thousands of pounds, you can now do in your garage at home. And that really is the basis of WikiHouse, to say, when we combine all those shifts that are coming, what does that mean? So the basic idea of the WikiHouse project is, what if we were to design a common building system that is shared completely open source? So it's not developed by just one company or owned by just one company, but it's developed by many companies, contributing it, improving it continuously, which they can then share and all own, belongs to everybody. And then the products that those designers produce using that building system can be manufactured not in a big centralized factory full of sweatshop labor, but everywhere, in communities, small businesses, garages, even in your own home. So this shift from centralized production to distributed production, distributed manufacturing. And finally, using things like automation is allowing us to move from a world of kind of one-size-fits-all copy and paste economics to a world where products can be more like Darwin's finches. They can adapt instantaneously at almost 0 cost to their particular needs, particular conditions. So yeah, at the heart of it all basically is, so one element of what we've been making is this idea that, okay, it opens the door to a language system for, say, this would be a lovely fancy video, but it's obviously not in this, of this kind of, essentially can be thought of as a coding language for space that can be instantaneously shared. So it's sort of like Lego. So you can very, very simply customize and change a design within the rules of the system. In future, of course, this will be algorithmic, lovely parametric tools. We haven't developed those yet. At the moment, people are just sharing models that are very easy to just hack and replicate, like playing with Lego bricks. Yeah. Then, of course, you can locally manufacture it in anywhere. And crucially, then, this really is bring coals to Newcastle, since I'm in the global capital of self-assembly. You can self-assemble the home. At this point, I will switch out to this video here, which would again should be all smooth and seamless, but it's not. So this is one example of this prototype. Now, this is not just something that happens here. In terms of locked into these joints, is something very, very interesting. So, I mean, actually, the idea of these sort of grammar of vernacular joints is literally, I mean, some of them literally are stolen from 14th century timber connections. So it's idea, this language of grammar, but locked into that is this thing of essentially lowering the thresholds of time, cost, and complexity. So that, and there's this wonderful design concept called poker yoke, I think, which is foolproofing it. So it makes it impossible to get a piece wrong or put in the wrong way around. So all the time, essentially, you're designing this kit system so that it's incredibly hard to get it wrong, incredibly safe to build. So there's a lot of, it looks like sort of just fun, hey, playing with Lego, but actually there's a lot of really interesting hard-nosed legal elements to this in terms of, yeah, how you make it safe to build, how you make it certifiable even when built by amateurs, etc., etc. But the fundamental point is that it's a building system that makes it very, very simple for a team of amateurs to build something very fast. So this house here was, this was just a prototype house that we did last September in London. It was actually a two-story house with the lid missing. It wasn't just a box. And we built that and measured it at the end. And I'll go back to that. We got the tape measure out at the end. The difference between the house and the computer model of the house was 5 millimeters. That's our kind of boasting point. But that's actually really, really interesting, because normally to get that kind of construction precision, you have to go to some insanely expensive German company. But this was built by amateurs. And that's actually powerful, because a huge amount of the barriers and the skill is things going wrong and not knowing how to overcome them. So actually, when things just click together, it means that effectively you can do it yourself with your friends. Again, this would be an animation, but it's obviously not going to happen. So this is actually a house we're going to be building this summer using that system. And obviously, we've developed this chassis system. But onto that, you then build that out very quickly into your full house. So you can plug all the parts that are interoperable. So, and this is just one of these boasty pages about, oh, isn't it brilliant? The key message of this is that these are not sort of slightly flimsy timber houses. These are fundamentally, we're talking about passive house levels of performance, really robust homes, high levels of airtightness. Obviously, the fact and the key thing is that it's also interoperable and modular, so that you can get in, you can replace parts and maintain parts over the building's life. So essentially, a whole load of things about buildings that should have always been the case, but we never had time to just build into the system. And what that gets you, obviously, is this chassis, which you then build up, and we're trying to then follow through in terms of, again, making it incredibly simple to build out and complete that house. The ultimate ambition of the WikiHouse project is to make an open source common building system, which is a full stack building system. In other words, where many companies come together, contribute open source projects that are based on open standards and interoperable. So not just the problem of structure and envelope, as which is where we've been working primarily to kickstart the project, but open source interoperable solutions, other things like plug and play services that you can just click together, again, like Lego, off-grid energy, etc., etc. So massively lowering the thresholds and simplifying access to those sorts of technologies. That has obviously some pretty huge, broader implications, not just for new build houses. So one of those technologies is window. Again, a bit early stages on this, but we're trying to develop a very high energy performance window that can be manufactured for a fraction of the cost that you'd pay for a sort of passive house levels of windows. Looking at open source lighting and controls, smart homes, where crucially you, the end user, own your data. Because of course the new form of centralization that's happening in cities is not just the centralized production of houses, but also the centralized ownership of your personal data. This is a really amazing, so this is a guy called David Paulson. We collaborated with Arups on this project, and he works for Arups, and he did this amazing project. So this is a mechanical heat recovery ventilator. So it takes the waste air from the house, it recovers 70% of the energy, the energy being lost in the air being expelled. Back in the, you know, you get it. It's made from 3 elements. 3D printed plastic parts, a motor from a kid's toy, and recycled beer cans. And even the first prototype was matching the performance of the existing industry product. It costs about £24 to make. The existing industry product costs about £200 to buy. Really, really interesting innovation that would not work. It would still be, if you tried to produce it through a centralized manufacturing model, it would be just as expensive. So I'm going to skip through this. This is all boring. These are all just our boasty pages that we have to use. And of course, the key thing about this is it all belongs to you. So everything that we're developing is completely open source. Obviously, our initial, the community is enthusiastic, passionate designers, students, early manufacturers. It's beginning to get to the point now where we're moving towards commercialization, but that's cool. So we now have, actually, this is out of date, we have 20 chapters, I think, in various places around the world. And so when we're thinking about this, we're not just thinking about the technology, but we're also thinking about the new forms of organization that come with those technologies. So we have established, at the center of this system, we've established an organization called the WikiHouse Foundation, which is a non-profit organization which is aimed to be a kind of custodian and build the digital platform for the community, or rather allow the community to come together to collaboratively build the digital platform. Now that is in a way kind of mental, because we're in a tech world where everyone believes that the only way to build serious big digital infrastructure like peer-to-peer infrastructure like eBay and Airbnb is to do it through a sort of venture capital model. So what we're currently trying to do is get enough partners together who see value in this, big companies, small companies, whoever, who see value in this and saying, yes, invest to help us build this, but don't invest to own an equity stake in it so that you can just become a rentier kind of owner of it, but rather invest so that you then get to use the system and derive all the potential benefits of it. I won't go into this. This is the digital infrastructure that we're aiming to, how we're going to do that. And out at the end of that are becoming the first sort of products, if you like, on projects. So some of them are unique one-off projects. Some of them are sort of replicable products like this that can be customized, et cetera, et cetera. And hopefully there'll be some of those happening in Sweden at some point, and someone will lead the way. So the really interesting thing is to then, okay, given this potential third industrial revolution, suddenly we can use these technologies to address the too damn difficult problem. We can question that fundamental assumption, that fundamental thing we took for granted, which is that we are dependent on top-down housing providers to solve our housing crisis. So what could that mean for the way that we develop neighborhoods, and what would that mean politically? So we take the same plot of land, it's worth the same amount of money, but instead of selling it to one person with a huge chunk of capital, we sell it to many people with a small amount of capital each. And we divide it up into plots. And maybe the first thing that we would do is create a community factory, a sort of seed prototype building, which is, in a way, also something potentially to copy, but it also has a machine there, and it's a kind of community parliament where all existing residents and future residents can meet and debate, getting rid of the insider-outsider problem, but also getting rid of the top-down, bottom-up problem, because actually here you can have a mediated environment, not just in virtual space, but in physical space, where local authorities and mayors and companies can connect with individuals. So that's actually quite important. By the way, sometimes you just call this a fab lab. And this is the amazing power of fab labs, is that they potentially serve that role. And what they would do is together, instead of doing this applications to a human model in planning, which is completely too damn difficult. Like if you go to a city planner and say, hey, would you like to get one application from a professional or 100 from 100 amateurs? They'll you know, their heart, they'll say, yeah, lovely, and with their hand, they'll do this. So actually, we've got to fundamentally change our approach to that. Now, we have these things called general permitted developments, but now, of course, we have the web, we have computers, we have parametric rules-based tools, so there's no reason why we can't make it incredibly simple for the community, perhaps voting, perhaps working together, to work with the local authority to develop a basic set of neighborhood rules. And the rules can be pretty much anything you want, but once those rules are set, you don't have to, as long as you stay within the rules, you're free to develop however you like. And this is actually super powerful from a democratic legitimacy point of view, because what you're doing is you're moving the planning system upstream of the market, not downstream of the market. So instead of our current system where the market says, I want to do this and I'm the only option, say yes or no, we flip it where we say we have a civic discourse first about the way that we want to design, and then we let the market do its work and find out the best way that it could do it. So we move, by the way, a lot of the legislation to do that already exists. It doesn't, we're just not using it. And then, okay, you need an initial capital from plot sales, perhaps, to install the basic infrastructure and plots. And then people can build. And we're not, of course, suggesting that they only use the WikiHouse system, because what we need here is an industry where we're not dependent on just 4 companies. We're not just dependent on 10. We're not just, you know, we're not dependent. We've got free, proper competition of companies who want to work for you to service your aim to get the best, most sustainable homes possible. So just by separating the land from the house economically, you create a proper competitive market of companies wanting to help you do this. So some people will go the whole hog and they'll build the whole house for themselves. Most people, some people will just buy it off the hook from a company, like, you know, Muji do this in Japan. And I'm sure, you know, obviously IKEA and BoClock have been that's definitely in their range of possibility. But then most people will do things in the middle, where they'll do some of the work themselves and some of the and they'll hire other people to others. So what you're actually doing here is combining not just top-down financial capital, but also bottom-up social capital. That means, in the most blunt sense, you're not just talking about affordable housing. Your houses actually get cheaper, because you can do some of the work for yourself. It also has a load of other, if you like, sideways benefits. There is actually a thing in psychology called the IKEA effect, which is basically that people love things more that they built. And so you're actually getting a whole load of social benefits, because the process of making the neighborhood is also making a community, unlike the current models where your neighbor is just whoever happens to buy the mortgage next door. So we're getting actual neighborhoods which were designed and invested in as places to live. They're actually affordable. You actually know who your neighbors are. You actually have social ties. And of course, they were built by the people who are going to pay the heating bill. So we can start to move towards radically resilient, sustainable things. We have the technologies to do this, but we're not deploying them because we're trying to build housing through the wrong market that doesn't value them. And also that community factory then becomes a long-term community asset, potentially a learning platform, perhaps just a village hall. Like we used to build village halls. We don't do that anymore. We just build supermarkets now. But actually, we will see a return to this idea of local, basic, community-level education and economic infrastructure, places to start a business. And again, that's what the Fab Lab movement is at the very front edge of. So what does that mean? The basic headline narrative, if you like, that we take back for governments who are saying, what do we do about housing, is to say, we are not going to be able to unlock this knot using the same old top-down housing systems. Because also, by the way, what I didn't say on that is this is also addressing that problem of democratic legitimacy. Because if you go to the local people and say, hey, would you like new housing which is made by this company top-down, or would you like the opportunity to buy a plot and make your own housing, suddenly you'll find the support for new development goes through the roof. When people come to, it really annoys me when I hear people talk about these big infrastructural challenges, and they say, oh, why can't we be more like China and just temporarily push this democracy thing into the back seat for a while? No, the answer, the solution is more democracy, not less. I have a total sympathy with NIMBYs, people who are resisting new development, because actually they're being asked to bear all the costs of new development and they get none of the benefits. Well, actually, if you make an economic system in which they get the benefits, they'll, of course, be much more in favor of it. So in the UK, at least, I'm sure you guys have an equivalent. We have a target, which is how many houses we think we actually need to meet demand. It's pretty much agreed by everyone in industry that the existing industries cannot do it. So our big takeaway idea for architecture industry and for architects going beyond the walls of their own paycheck to actually redesign the systems and economics behind architecture, taking that out to businesses and particularly to government, there is one big idea that we're trying to peddle, which is the central mission needs to be to build a new housing sector in the 21st century. And the housing sector is called the citizen sector. And everything we do should be focused on how can we scale that up? What prevents that scaling it up? And that includes, yes, these common infrastructural technologies like WikiHouse, but it also includes new forms of finance, like community-level finance. It also includes new forms of planning rule. And one of the planning rules that I've been arguing for is instead of sticking to this old-fashioned idea of state versus market, the key distinction we actually need to make is between homes as a place to live and homes as a financial asset. So I've been arguing that governments should create a new planning use class category that separates those two out, which allows local authorities and citizens to say, we approve that kind of housing, that kind of development, but we don't approve that kind of development. Effectively to unlock a new parallel market which values housing in a totally different way, and then just let it play out. Now that would work here as well, because it could mean that the government wouldn't have to relinquish all the stuff about rental controls, but actually it could create a new opportunity market that could actually lead to affordable housing with democratic consent. So yeah, I'm a big believer in that Buckminster Fuller idea of don't fight forces, redesign them. That's the power of designers. We sit across the political boundaries because these obsolete political parties are just fighting like the last century's arguments about who owns the means of production, and it's like that's not the question anymore. The power of design is it can come along and it can pull the rug out from underneath those problems. So it's actually amazing that this idea is gaining traction on both the left and the right of politics, because the right is interested in the idea of free, proper markets, proper competition, but the left is interested in the idea of actual communities and empowering people and affordability. So let's go back finally to the very beginning, to this idea of the good life. We as architects need to find a way to be useful, because the truth is we have just spent the last 100 years just working for whichever big client, top-down housing provider came through the door. Whether it was the state or the market, we were there ready to produce drawings. They're not going to do it anymore, so we have to design new ways to work out how we can bring back that idea of the good life. I think IKEA is perhaps one of the great examples of, Coca-Cola, Levittown, IKEA, all those they're kind of these great commercial institutions of the rise of the middle classes. And it's interesting, by the way, if you look right now globally as inequality grows, that they're often the companies who are struggling. So if you look at McDonald's right now and Tesco's in the UK, these are the great middle class companies that they're actually struggling right now. So we actually need to work on this question of how are we actually going to scale these solutions to work on real life things. And this is where finally I'll come back to this point, democracy. When we talk about democracy, as much as I love today, election day in the UK, the problem is we've defaulted into a view that sees democracy as a form of government. And therefore this black and white condition, which is like, you've got it, you haven't. And the problem with that was that that's just not true. Actually, the truth is that democracy is a design diagram. It literally means demos, people, kratos, power. The amount of power that goes there. That power is more than a vote every 5 years. The power is literally, do you have the power to produce, the power to choose, the power to get access to certain core resources? Do you have capabilities? It might just be electrical power, i.e. electrical power produced by many solar panels on many rooftops instead of by one company with a coal-fired power station. So we built this amazing idea of democracy, but we built it on massively centralized institutions and infrastructure. So the job of the next generation of designers is the central job, which is how are we going to engineer our way to a new form of abundance, a new rise of that idea of the good life, but moving from the massively centralized, undemocratic structures to massively decentralized capabilities and resources. So that is not a political problem. That's not a problem that any political party can solve on their own. It only can be done by thinking of the industrial system and the economic system that we're working in. And I've said before, and I'll finish on this point, I think the basic headline message is this, which is that throughout the 20th century, we created this good life by democratizing the right to consume, whether it was consuming from a centralized government or consuming from a centralized market or whatever it may be. The centralized nature of those things are now what is leading to their failure. So the central mission for design in the next century is how are we going to democratize the right to produce. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. I'd like to hear some heckling on housing. That's it, I'm finished.
Thank you very much, Alastair. Just a quick question for me first before we sort of open the floor. On the question of planning and sort of planning regulations, because as planning works now, sort of decisions are made first and then planning comes later, which is sort of when you think of the meaning of the words, is extremely paradoxical.
It's an upside down view of planning.
So what could be an incentive, and to who, to change that sort of way of doing things?
I think the best incentive always is instead of trying to persuade people to do the more difficult thing, as a designer, you can make it not the most difficult thing. So the way that we will persuade people or incentivize people to do it will be to make it easier than the current option. So we're going to have to build it.
What do you mean by people? I mean,
so for example, take your, say, local or national government. So at the moment, for national government to say, oh yeah, we're going to make this massive planning reform, it would be really hard for them. Possibly not politically, although it might be politically, but it certainly would be hard because it would involve a huge number of unknowns. They wouldn't know if the technologies work. They suffer from a faster horses problem. So actually, these by far the more sensible thing is for us to build the digital infrastructure that demonstrates how easy it could be, and then they'll just start adopting it, and then they'll start using it, and eventually it will follow. So if you see the example of Creative Commons licenses, they were invented 10, 11 years ago. Only really now, in the last few years, have governments begun seriously adopting the use of Creative Commons licenses on their output at scale. So actually, the leadership isn't done by governments, and I think one of the problems with politics is we tend to our idea of politics is we complain to the government, but what you're completely just you're just repeating the cycle that we are. And by the way, you should complain to government. You should hold your government to account, right? Of course we should, but. This idea that, hey, how come you haven't solved this problem for me yet, is effectively just repeating this cycle that you are a consumer and they are the provider. Whereas actually the idea of saying, no, let's be civic entrepreneurs. Let's actually go and build the thing as designers because we can imagine it. So actually, let's build the trial digital platform. Let's try and trial it out at a neighborhood level. And some people begin to do this, right? Begin to experiment with how could we make a digital platform that makes it really, really easy to design those rules and make those planning systems happen, and let if you like, let the institutions follow. Is that an answer?
Yes, of course. But I'm also thinking about that the model already exists in sort of at least aspects of it in sort of historic.
Yeah.
If you look back into sort of traditional perimeter block, 19th century.
Yeah. And arguably that's what New York
first set the rules, and then they apply it to everyone, and then
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't need to be a fancy
I
digital
think,
model. It can be a set of
it's
sort
also
of
about
rules.
where the, again, I suppose it's also about where the economics lie, because in those times, actually that model, where you just create the rules and let it run, is actually way cheaper. So in an age of austerity, when governments have no money, they should really be embracing that model, because actually it's way more practical. The reason they don't, though, is because it's a form of power that they still want to hang on to. So because most, certainly in the UK, I don't know if it's the same here, but most local authorities are still dependent that the only way to get affordable housing is to lure the developers. So please, it is viable, please build us some housing. We'll let you build really rubbish housing as long as you give us just 20 affordable houses on the site. It's what I call the burger and salad approach to political economy. Which is you let the market give you a burger as long as they promise to give you a salad on the side. And the problem is it doesn't work, because by the time you've eaten the burger, no amount of salad will undo the unhealth. It's a bit like asking a highway, to mix my metaphors, it's a bit like asking a highwayman to rob you of everything they own as long as they cut you into a share of the profits. It just doesn't stack up economically. But because councils and local authorities are still looking to that form of development as the only option available, then of course they're not going to want to let it go. Of course they're going to want to maintain that form of power, that trading position where they can try and squeeze public benefits out of the market. Now that's not because they're corrupt, it's because actually potentially they're good people and they want community infrastructure and they don't know who else can build it. So it is a hard leap, and it will be done first through pilot projects and things like that. So the UK government has been consulting on a policy called Right to Build, which will activate the idea of local authorities being obliged to put over sites to be sold off as plots for custom builders. So they're beginning to get into this idea that we need to scale up the citizen economy, but they don't really have an understanding of scale, and actually the local authorities mostly don't really know how to do it. But that's interesting, because that's a design problem. So as architects, what that could mean for, or designers, what that could mean for us is that instead of, when we graduate from here, instead of sending out our CV to a company working in the old economy, we could actually go out and see if we can design something and make something that grows the new one. You know, that wasn't a very articulate answer either.
Anyone?
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. I really agree on it, and I find it very inspiring. I was actually thinking, you know, the future is still yet to be established, and I think the generation that is going to profit the most of your idea, of the whole idea of sharing, and you know, like.
It's not our idea.
Exactly.
I mean,
no, you know,
it's
like
been around for years.
this generation is maybe not earning money even, or not. Maybe I'll just leave it because yeah. Yeah, I was wondering, I know in the UK there's the other company who also does it kind of commercially, Facet Homes, you definitely know them already. Yeah. And I've been discussing these things with my friends, even friends like within the school or within the field, and I find it very difficult even sometimes to convince people from our field about the idea. How do you get to the people out there? Many people are, even though they're educated, they are not educated about this thing. Their minds are full of idea how the old market growth works. Yeah. Therefore, how do you get them? How do you go to politicians? How do you think? How do you wanna? How is the way to make this whole thing bigger and not only niche?
Our strategy so far has been
beyond the price, of course.
Has been don't. In the sense that if you put a thing out there and you just see who comes back, so then you're not wasting your time arguing against people who will never understand it. You just put a thing out there and you see who emerges. It's really interesting who emerges. So yes, it is some architects, tends to be young architects, students who actually looked at the existing road that was mapped out for them in the future and they said no thanks. And so that's been our kind of thing first, is that you don't need to convince everybody, you only need to convince the next person, and then it just spreads. And that gets up to a certain point where it sort of builds a movement, and et cetera, But yes, in terms of actual then, where you do need a legal change, or you do need a massive systemic change, my truthful impression is that we are really quick to create this idea of the other guy who's against us. But actually, when you get in the room with them, you realize that they too just have a series of pressures on them. You know, most politicians, their actual job day to day is don't lose the media cycle. Right? So if you can make a way for them to win the media cycle by doing what you want to do, then it's good. So it almost like when you approach a problem as a designer, it's not being Machiavellian, but it is just understanding other people and saying, actually, I can totally understand the economics of what you're dealing with. How can we change that? And then equally, it's the same with companies as well. So this third industrial revolution is happening, right? In the same way that there were Kodaks the last time round, and there were Incartas, there will be even more Kodaks, and there will be even more Incartas. So actually, sometimes those companies will come to us. The lead followers, again, will come to us and say, actually, yeah, we think you're right. We think Jeremy Rifkin and co are right. There is this technological revolution coming. What does value look like for us in the future? And actually, one of the interesting things that's happening is, in the future of capitalism, fundamentally, which is potentially one very positive, one very regressive path. So the whole of capital is very broad brush economic theory here, so I apologize. But you know, the whole of capitalism in the 20th century was basically predicated around who owns the means of production. Suddenly, if we're moving into a future where nobody owns the means of production, what does capital own? Capital doesn't go away, it moves. So I think what we're seeing it doing is it's moving into particularly two main areas. So one is soft assets, which is IP, and then the lawyers to defend it, and personal data, and that will have its own fight. That's what Tim Berners-Lee's argument that we need a Magna Carta for the internet. And actually, my colleague Sarah at WikiHouse Foundation is doing some really fascinating work on again how we can make a different approach to personal data in the future. And so soft assets is one side, and on the other side it's moving into hard, limited commodities such as land and materials. The land, don't we know it, we all see land as becoming an investment commodity. The materials we haven't seen so much yet, but actually if you look at what the big companies are doing right now, they're all buying up their supply chains all the way back. So I think it won't be long before Apple refuse to sell you a device. Now, environmentalists will cheer because it will be much closer to a circular loop economy, but actually, from a perspective of innovation and democracy, it will be a terrible idea. It will be terrible news.
That's actually very interesting to see how big companies, how big players are going to react to that. Yeah. And I know, for example, Skanska already ordered research also in the UK about concrete 3D printing, and I'm really, really curious what we're going to find out, because they might have lots to lose, or maybe to win.
Again, the thing there is this question of technology is the answer, but what was the question? So most 3D printing technologies will primarily be used by speculative developers, because they have a high capital setup cost. They'll be used by speculative developers to just de-laborize the construction process. So you won't have to go and get your sweatshop labor anymore. You can just get a robot to do it. But it won't change anything. It'll just be like there'll be 3D printing small concrete boxes that you can't afford instead of stacking them up with bricks. So what? Exactly. There'll always be those ones. People are always trying to apply new technologies like alloy wheels to a horse and cart. But eventually the systemic change, will creep in. But there is also a more optimistic side to the capitalism story, potentially, which is embedded in this change in the way we understand value. Because suddenly, big companies, suddenly then, when the world is more connected, when we have more data, failures come back to bite you on the arse much more quickly. So that means that companies become very exposed, and the bigger you are, the more exposed you are to, if you like, what used to be called the externalities. So things like climate, or I mean, still are, but climate change, et cetera, will come back to bite you on the ass much more quickly. So that's really, really interesting, because suddenly governments and big enough companies will begin to realize that actually the total liability of everybody being in bad housing massively outweighs the profits of this inflated real estate sector. So actually, at some point, capitalism will begin to go, hold on a minute, I would rather invest in the economic value of everybody having an amazing place to live, the home as a social and economic platform, than I would in this incredibly unstable asset of land speculation. And I think that we're beginning to see that with things like social impact bonds and stuff like that. And again, my colleague and sort of boss, Indy Indy Johar, is like, he's super interesting on all that stuff and what that stuff actually means in terms of changing finance. Is going to be super interesting.
I have lots of technical questions, but maybe maybe you wanted to ask something about like politics or
No, let's flip. I love that. We should flip between the boring. How many screws? How many screws?
Yeah, no. I mean,
one technical question that I can flip it. I was just wondering what kind of insulation you're using.
Any. So one of the we have at the core of. So WikiHouse is I mean, in the future it will be many different technologies. All right, developed by many. So hopefully it will involve 3D printed concrete, or hopefully 3D printed mud. So we can move into the future where you need hardly anything to produce something amazing. So but the fun, you strip it back. It's a building system. Then you strip it back from that. It's actually a community of people. And you strip it back from that. It's a set of principles. So we have these core principles, and one of the principles is. Trying to make everything open and modular. So the idea should be you should be able to sub in almost anything and the rest of the system still works, which is, again, an established principle in the software coding world. So really, WikiHouse, people are like, oh, it's so innovative. It is not that innovative. Like, these are all principles that have existed in like the software industry for a long time. It's just that we've been slow to the party. So we're just trying to interpret exactly the same sets of principles into the real world. So insulation, yes, it's whatever you can get. Now, the powerful thing about things is there's an irony here, which is in order to open this up, you need to standardize stuff. But we have standards, and we have the computer tools to understand the complexity of standards. So as long as we can create soft standards that says, as long as your insulation meets the following requirements, then you can use anything, it also opens the door to innovation. Because suddenly someone can say, so at the moment, for example, the current WikiHouse building system uses sheet materials, right, like plywood. But suddenly someone could come along and say, well, I've made a new sheet material made of recycled plastic that can match the same performance because it meets the same standards. So the power of standards and protocols is huge.
I was wondering more like purely technically if you also have a material that you can kind of manufacture the same way you manufacture the plywood to have it pre-cut, so to speak.
I'd be very interested to see that. I guess it would depend on what the base material is. I think if you did subtractive manufacturing on insulation, it would probably be very inefficient on space. So good examples, though, are potentially really interesting. It's obvious one, things like cellulose, which is used already, and facet homes do use that as well as people using WikiHouses do. Which is great because it's recycled and it's so fragmented that it can expand to fill any space, and so that's kind of interesting. I think generally trying to go for local closed loop circular material economy cycles will be the most interesting thing around that. But equally, there's loads of interesting stuff. The team at Fab Lab Barcelona are working. There's a bunch of people there working on insulation grown with fungi. So that's really interesting as well. So this point where if we can create these power, the capability to produce amazingly high performance products using almost no resources, then open source those technologies. And I think the other argument that's coming forward very strongly now, which people are again finally getting, is that there is no point talking about addressing climate change. There is no point talking about circular economies unless you're talking about open source. That, the famous William Gibson quote, the future's already here, it's just not very well distributed yet, so we've got to distribute it. And so that's the power of those sort of technologies, because again, it's just lowering the thresholds, where the threshold is time, cost, skill, scarcity. Loads of fascinating stuff. So it's, in a way, that I've said many times before, WikiHouse it's just like vernacular, but it's vernacular on speed. So it adapts to in the same way that vernacular architecture is adapted to the particular economics of where they were. It's already in its very early stages, the WikiHouse system is doing that. So actually a series of innovations in the frame were led by the fact that the New Zealand team, in New Zealand, there's only like 1 or 2 companies providing plywood. So there's a monopoly problem on that, and so prices are very high. And so they responded to that in the way that they designed the structures. It's really, really interesting. So you can create this environment where design responds to economics, which is not, of course, in what most architects have been used to over the last few years, where you just have someone where they don't really understand the economics. They just say, draw me a funny shape, and then throw it over the balcony and leave it to an engineer to work out how to build it.
No, you create a kind of a new market also with the third party developers of materials and stuff than if you give them a system to work in, and then they don't need to
so this
find
whole
out all the rules.
Exactly, and this is the open derivative markets argument, which is also one of the big unknowns, uncertainties of projects like WikiHouse is about the automation thing. People quite rightly might look at that at this project and say, well, hold on a minute, you're effectively being complicit in the demonetization of the economy. So you can give people, you know, basically people lose jobs in the construction industry. There's basically two arguments. Is one, that's happening anyway, so we should probably make sure that everybody has reciprocal access to a lower cost home. And so therefore these technologies should be owned by everybody. But the other one, the other argument, which I think is fair to make, is actually it's moving from a centralized economy, which actually employs relatively as few people as it can afford to employ, to a decentralized economy, which actually employs as many people who want to be employed and can be employed. Except, you know, it's a sort of classic Jane Jacobs.
Construction worker, you can sell your new parts to WikiHouse on eBay.
Yeah. And that's kind of cool, right? If you take that CNC machine, if you speak to a conventional architect or designer who's been working on prefabrication over the last period of time and say, how much does it cost to set up a prefabrication factory? They'll say, well, you need an area about half the size of a football pitch and several £100,000. So, well, no, you need about £25,000 in a garage. Okay, your production output is going to be lower, so you could easily scale that up, but actually that is the disruptive element, because it means that actually let's retool that local bottom-up economy. Now, if you take a global view on that, which obviously, you know, we should do, we should be realistic. We know that, you know, architecture is only involved in about 2% of the buildings worldwide. Most of the cities in most of the countries are bottom-up developed cities, but they're crap, right? Now, actually, but economically, they're in a way a much more successful model, right? Because they're made by their users, they're made by a distributed, prosperous economy, but to very, very low standards, and we don't have infrastructure to support them. We don't have legal institutions to create them. Well, what we're saying is with these technologies is suddenly we can go to really tiny, small businesses and superpower them with really epic technologies. So actually, of course, we should be using that. I mean, of course, we should be doing that.
Yeah, they had a follow-up there, but maybe somebody else want to jump in before, or should we take you first? Okay. Just trying to be polite and get to everybody.
Trying to be democratic.
Talking about money, I noticed there was this one picture with 800 pounds per square meter. I have no idea what's the normal price of a square meter in UK.
That's also the point, of course, because we get access to that. So a few years ago, there was this competition which the UK government ran called the 60k house, right? Which was, and all these companies responded by building a 60k house, and then when they got built, the price tag was 250k. People were like, hold on a minute, that's also one of the problems. Mostly we don't know. I say it's arguably it's not necessarily the key metric. 800 is only our initial key target. So our target in the UK is to be able to build homes for, once you've got the land, to be able to build a finished house for £800 a square meter, which is affordable to most people from a middle, you know, sort of lower and upwards, lower middle classes and upwards. But it needs to go down, right? But of course, the only way is get better, because there's no one to monopolize it. So the only things that drive prices up generally are when you have monopolies or the cost of the basic raw materials increases. Well, neither of those should happen, except within the WikiHouse system. They will only happen outside it in terms of land or whatever. So hopefully that price will continually drive down as we make the system a little bit better.
What about the production, like the assembly time? Like I've noticed that facing homes, we were advertising, you know, homes like happening within weeks. I can totally imagine that one.
Yeah. So I mean, we love Facet. I'm not sure Facet feels so chuffed about us. But I mean, I would love it. What I'm really hoping at some point is that Facet will see something that someone in the WikiHouse community has done and go, well, that's useful, we'll adopt that. Yeah, I mean, it's great. I think it is a really interesting thing about the speed and scale of production. So Facet's response is they work within those limitations and said, right, well, they only do a certain scale of project. I actually think we can move beyond you know, that, and actually you can use that. Because, for example, if you're, like I said with the ventilator, if you're a centralized company and wanted to produce 1,000 homes in, like, as quickly as possible, this model would not be the best way to do it, because actually you'd create a bottleneck around the CNC machines. Now, there are CNC machines that, of course, that can cut really quickly and self-feed and blah, blah, blah. So you can scale up to certain, but you'd still have a bottleneck in production. They take about, well, I mean, general rule of thumb is leave about half an hour per sheet. So you're talking about usually a month, potentially, to cut a whole house. Now, higher capacity machines can halve that. But actually, to a big company, that's, oh man, that's really slow. But if you're a one-off individual or a community or a group, well, that's great. Like, you can manufacture over that, of course, while you're building the next one. And actually, they go up really quickly. So that one we show, I mean, okay, it wasn't fully fitted out, but that went up in 7 days. So they go up really, really quickly. And that helps in the sense that, I mean, it's not necessarily that important, but it helps in the sense that you can't say to your friends, hey, I'm building a house, come and help me for a month. They'll say, well, I'm sort of busy. I've got a job. But you can say, hey, come for a week, come for a weekend, and we'll have loads of fun, and I'll provide pizza, and you can build. And actually, people, of course, they love it.
I saw it. It's beautiful. I mean, I probably shouldn't say it because it costs like people jobs, but I thought it's kind of how nice it is to build something with your friends without troublesome, construction workers and they.
Yeah, but again, I mean, obviously, I completely agree with you. And one of the things that's always amazing is how much people just love, you know, this industrial economy that we got, this idea that remote production and consumption. There's almost something psychologically built into us where we want to make things. And so people just love it. I mean, literally, when we build one, you know, and others are doing the same, hundreds of volunteers saying, can I come and join in? Because it's so much fun just to make this thing. And it's just easy enough that people can. At the same time, it is not about making people unemployed, because actually most people will not do all the work themselves. They'll say, actually, I want to hire, you know, someone to supervise me so I can get my warranty, or I'll hire a thing. One thing we found is that everything's going swimmingly, then the self-builder can do it. But as soon as they hit a glitch, a problem, work stops. And actually, it helps to have one builder who's supporting and supervising you on site. Will just come in, there'll be a troubleshooter, they'll overcome that problem, and you can move on. So it's absolutely more about a distributed economy than about no economy. And actually, that totally plays out. And again, it's the argument I make about architects, is that architects at the moment, they only sell their services to about the richest 1%. Whereas actually there's a whole load of other people who can't afford to hire an architect for 6 months, but they can afford to hire an architect for a week. So actually, if you can make a system which says, actually, I can hire you for a week, then suddenly architects can be more like Coca-Cola. They can move down the long tail. They can sell their services to a massively expanded marketplace, and crucially, the middle classes. Because unfortunately, unlike Henry Ford, whose big innovation was that essentially his cars could be bought by his own workers, etc., the really powerful ones is when you can get production into that middle class. So if architecture can turn around in 10 years' time and say, we at scale sell our design services to the middle classes, it will have turned from a rather niche sort of artistic concern to something that seriously has value. And even if you see it in purely business terms, you know, that's true. This is one, what was his name who did, Daniel Dendra did a wonderful TEDx talk years ago about his project called Open SimSim. And he talks about this thing about how architects only are responsible for about 2% of the buildings as well. That's an ethical problem, but it's also like a really rubbish business share, like market share. So actually, you know, even if you see it purely in those terms, architecture needs to kick up the pants. We ultimately want to be useful in the world, right? One way or another.
I think we'll continue the conversation informally. I think I think I hear the music still on, so the bar is probably still open. Or so if you like, you can take another drink or have a chat with you afterwards. I guess. Thank you again for coming, and thank you all for listening.
Sorry about the technology. It was going to be really swish. What was the question?